Hello, welcome everybody. We're just gonna let everybody trickle in a bit, but we'll get started soon. Yeah, so I think, we've got a lot to talk about today, and we've got some really great speakers that are gonna be sharing with us. So I'm gonna kind of get this started now, and we'll kind of go from there. So welcome everyone. On behalf of the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point and the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, we're excited to have you here for our Adaptation and Action webinar. Explores forest management strategies for changing climate. Um, from a sustainable fundamental ecological process to realigning ecosystems after disturbance. This series will provide foresters, land managers, and conservation professionals with tools and examples of how to strengthen the resilience and long-term health and sustainability of forest ecosystems. So my name is Johanna Dupre. I'm a natural resources professional with UW Extension, and I'm going to be moderating the session today. Before we begin today, we acknowledge that UW-Stevens Point occupies the ancestral lands of Ho-Chunk and Menominee people. Please take a moment to honor their connection to the land and that of all Indigenous peoples. Okay, so we're going to move on to some housekeeping things. And once we go through a few things, then I can introduce the speakers and we can get started. So just starting out, this session will be recorded, and those session recordings and additional resources, the evaluation link, and any information about the continuing education component will all be available on the website. We do our best to try to get these sessions out in the first 2 weeks, so you can look for that. If you do want to receive continuing education credit, then you want to make sure that you fill out the Microsoft form provided during the session, and that link I'm sure will show up a few different times if you need it. If you do have any questions, you can also reach out to the website on the screen, wfc@uwsp.edu. Okay. Sorry, just doing my notes. Okay. So this series is hosted by the Wisconsin Forestry Center at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point and the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, the Department of Forestry. At the end of the session, we will have a link to an evaluation. Please fill that out. That helps make these webinar series better. So look for that. Um, a couple more things. As a part of this webinar, your microphone and your camera will be disabled, but we do want to hear from you all. So there's a couple of different options. There is a Q&A function. If you want to ask a question of our speakers, the Q&A function is the best way to do that. So just go to the bottom of your screen and hit the Q&A button. You can comment in the chat, and there will be someone looking at the chat to try to help you out. But again, if you want to ask a question, the Q&A option is the best way to do that. But we would love to know who's here. So, if you'd like to take a minute and just say hi and tell us where you're from. And then also, we of course want to say a big thank you to the Wisconsin SIF. They are they are providing a grant for this program. The mission of Wisconsin SIF is to promote and enhance SIF and sustainable forestry practices within Wisconsin through grassroots collaboration with stakeholders, partners, and those who benefit from managed forest with a focus on AF core priorities, and the Wisconsin SIC ensures that forests and their many benefits will perpetuate into the future. Okay. So that was all of the housekeeping. Now I am going to introduce some of our speakers. We are going to have two speakers today. And the topic today is focusing on maintaining and enhancing species and structural diversity. And so starting out, we're going to have Gena Abramson from the Forestry Specialist, who is a forestry specialist from the Bad River Tribe. And then we will also be hearing from Matt Dallman, the Northwoods Strategy Director with the Nature Conservancy. Basically, the way that this is going to work is that we will have our first presenter, we'll have an opportunity for a couple of questions, and then our second presenter will start, and then we will have more time for questions at the end. So yeah, I think we're ready to get started. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Hello, can everyone hear me? Okay? Okay. I'm Gena Abramson, forestry specialist, forest manager for the Bad River Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa in far northern Wisconsin. And it's an honor and privilege to present our trajectory on climate change mitigation, and more specifically, strategy number 5 in the NIACS climate change menu of adaptation strategies, maintaining, enhancing species and structural diversity. Today I'll be sharing with you our trajectory on strengthening our forest resilience, which includes the history of our forest, long-term planning, planting projects, release projects, long-term monitoring, and hopefully someday research. Next slide. Located on the south shore of the western part of the most western Great Lake, Gitchigummy or Lake Superior, the Bad River Reservation rests on around 96,000 acres of forest and 13,000 acres of sloughs or wetlands, meshing the land into the Big Lake, as we like to call it. The tribe also reserved control of 200 acres on the northeast tip of Madeline Island, in the Apostle Islands, as their historical fishing grounds. In the past decade, much more land on Madeline Island and on the mainland within the reservations has been acquired. Bad River, or Mushkee-Zibi, Medicine River, is one of the 11 federally recognized tribes in the area that is now called Wisconsin. Next slide. Here you can see kind of how our history is laid out. After colonization, there was the Great Cutover. As most everyone knows, the whole Northwoods was more or less clear cut for the building of cities like Chicago. And so here, this first picture show from the Wisconsin Historical Society shows the picture of the Great Cutover. And so just a little bit of history. Algonquin people from the East Coast area came here to find food that grows on water, manoomin or wild rice as prophesized. When they arrived, they found everything they needed to live amongst the earth and water with reciprocity. Unfortunately, as the lands became colonized, the US government used unethical means to remove their livelihood. After the cutover was the burnover. After that, the land began to restore itself through succession with pioneer species, namely aspen, both clicking and bigtooth. Other pioneer species that thrive here are paper birch and balsam fir. Without the forest, the woodland gatherers were without the resources they needed. Lands were sold off out of necessity. And industrial forestry became prevalent once the forest regenerated as aspen. This cycled through the 20th century until mills closed and the tribe reacquired most of those lands Well, while the tribe is happy to have control of that land back, we have a degraded forest. And we need to bring it back to health. The BIA has primarily managed the trust lands, which is about half of the tribe's lands. And they've used the mantra of a fiduciary responsibility to the tribal members when referring to their management of the USA Trust lands to continue the cycle of clear cutting until the tribe decided to hire their own professional forester just about 7 years ago. Next slide. Since 2019, Bad River Forestry has been focused on the 7th generation through ecologically focused forest management activities. Can you guys see the slide with the kids in the middle? There we go. So when I have the opportunity to mentor or help lead summer youth programs, or even when I see kids in the community, I like to say to them, hey, you're my boss, I work for you. And it helps me with humility and respect for the tremendous honor that I have in serving the people of Bad River, past, present, and future. Plus it gets them thinking. And they are tremendously wealthy in land and water, and it's our job to show them how to protect it. The next slide. So eventually all of our essentially all of our harvest areas have been inventoried in the past few years. The upper right-hand sentence is an excerpt from our 10-year plan. And so it kind of is the main focus of that stewardship plan is to convert timber stands back to pre-cut over cover types. So we've got good information on what we have, being able to collaborate with folks like Matt Dallman from the Nature Conservancy, with Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, and other organizations have provided us with valuable insight on how to carry out management in a way that mitigates climate change impacts. Our stewardship plan is based on diversifying the forest. Through silvicultural prescriptions, we can convert many of the aspen cover types to their secondary type simply by removing enough aspen. By keeping all long-lived species and removing aspen and ash, improved sunlight and moisture availability will give the secondary cover type what it needs to outcompete aspen regeneration. Next slide. So here we have strategy number 5, maintain and enhance species and structural diversity. And so we do that by promoting diverse age classes through planting, maintaining and restoring diversity of native species, planting primarily white pine. It's a very versatile species. And so also we retain biological legacies by trying not to cut any white pine unless it's a density situation or a hazard tree situation. And so by doing that, we establish reserves to maintain ecosystem diversity. Since white pine is a species that's very versatile in its need for light, nutrients, and moisture, we have underplanted a few hundred acres of young aspen with around 90,000 white pine seedlings. We've also planted yellow birch, cedar, silver maple, plum, white birch, and hemlock. These species have been chosen and planted in specific areas based on their shade tolerance as well as their moisture tolerance. Slide. Bijik. Yujik is northern white cedar. Yujik is one of the 4 sacred medicines that we want to promote it as much as possible because it's important for tribal members to have access to it. It promotes healing, specifically the lungs. So one of the ways to use it when you get a cold, you can add a few fronds of cedar into hot water to make delicious tea. The cedar that we planted here in this green ash stand is mainly intact with some mortality from this past winter. We'll be planting a few hundred more next week in this area for Earth Day activities. It's right in Odena, and it's just a couple acres, but it's pure green ash, and it's very aesthetically important. And I think it's probably underappreciated now, but when we lose it, I think people are going to realize how important that green ash stand is. So not looking forward to the mortality from the emerald ash borer, but to mitigate that, we're underplanting that with cedar. And deer browse really isn't an issue here on the reservation since we have a 7-month deer hunting season. So this stand of green ash is just now showing the first signs of EAB infestation. So hopefully we can take good enough care of the cedar to take over once the ash die completely. Next slide. So beginning in the spring of 2020, shortly after I started, we were helped out by the Nature Conservancy with a grant for 40,000 white pine seedlings and about 12,000 of other, a few other species to be planted. And so that was a good start for our diversification, structural diversification. In the fall of 2024, we planted 50,000 white pine. Last spring, we planted 1,000 cedar, trying to focus on that black ash understory. And going forward, we know that it's important to replace the ash along our waterways. The species we choose will likely be northern white cedar, yujik, or silver maple, Junia zinzibakwadwitib. Both of these are very important cultural species. Cedar is considered one of the 4 sacred medicines, along with sage, wheatgrass, and asema. Silver maple is important because it's relatively fast-growing species and can quickly restore individual areas that are lost to emerald ash borer. Additionally, silver maple can be tapped for sap with similar sugar content to red maple or box elder. Research trials have indicated good survival rates as well for silver maple. We're currently in the midst of the Bad River Urban Forest Green Space Improvement Project, funded by the Wisconsin DNR as well as the BIA, Bureau of Indian Affairs. And this includes hazard tree inventory, urban forest management plan, hazard tree removal project, and replacement planting with fruit and/or medicine trees. And we're about halfway through this project at this time. Plantings are expected to take place in 2027. Other future plantings will be in the forest in either aspen or ash dominated stands. Most of our waterways are lined with green ash. So will probably be, that'll probably be a big focus. Next slide. So we've got our release projects. In the past few years, we've taken a look at the regeneration, the artificial regeneration that from the planting in 2020. And so we've done some release work to provide more nutrients for these, more light availability. Historically, white pine was one of the most prevalent species on the reservation. It persists as a super canopy tree, taller than any other species and showing itself above the main canopy. These are considered grandmother Nokomis or grandfather Mishomis trees. We want more of them on the landscape. They're a powerful reminder of what the forest used to be. Many animals utilize them. There are frogs that utilize the canopy 100 feet from the ground for habitat. Eagles, Magiziwug, make their nests and lay their eggs in them. Eagles also perch above Lake Superior shoreline on them to hunt fish. What a sight it is to see Magiza fly a half-mile or a mile out onto the big lake only to come back with a big lake fish in its beak. It's really quite a sight to see. Next slide. So long-term monitoring is also part of our adaptation strategy. And so during the release process, our technician recorded tree heights and the length of the clearing that was completed to the next aspen tree to the south. And so this provides us with a good basis for some long-term monitoring and eventual data analysis. Next slide. Research. What distances of release are necessary or best for white pine seedlings to thrive? What sort of overstory age density or species works well or not for underplanting white pine seedling? Tracking growth of artificial regeneration as well as natural regeneration will help us determine which management strategy is best. Should we seed tree or shelter wood or existing mature white pine and hope that enough cones turn to seedlings? Should we keep our mixed woods diverse and underplant where necessary to transition aspen cover types into mixed woods? Should we wait for succession to transition the forest? Lack of fire on the landscape prevents high pine concentrations that once inhabited the landscape. The composition of the Bad River forest is forever changed because of that. Because there really is no let burn policy. And so forest suppression our fire suppression has really changed the landscape. Now and into the future, we need to make decisions that optimize the health and diversity of the forest for the next generations. Next slide. Through encouragement of both coniferous and deciduous long-lived native species, we can mitigate the impacts of climate change by underplanting areas that are known to be under threat. We can reduce the opportunities for invasive species, as well as prevent erosion and provide increasing nutrient availability to a new cohort of seedlings. By releasing young pine from vegetative competition, we also allow sunlight to reach the established seedlings to grow into a new age class of stand composition. With proper inventory and planning, we can identify the areas that need our help most. This forest is immense, and starting out, I was overwhelmed with the thought of managing such a vast forest. However, we can do what we can do, and so let's do it. However much we're able to impact, that's an improvement. And future timber sales will result in cover types being changed from aspen to northern hardwoods, pine, and mixed woods. These are all wins. It's hard work, but it's very rewarding. Yeah, it's a good life here on the Bad River Reservation. Minnow Bamada's a win. Next slide. So thank you very much for your time. And if I can answer any questions, I am happy to do that.
Hey everyone. So we do have some time for some questions. So again, if you'd like to ask a question, please put it in the Q&A feature that's at the bottom of the screen. Just starting out, you did mention that you had some long-term monitoring. What are you hoping to research or learn from that data?
Primarily, well, I think that there's people out there that will be able to utilize the information. They have questions that they want answered, but by recording the distances to the nearest competition, we can see like where are the thresholds with how much do we need to release before we really see the biggest impact on growth rates and survival.
Thank you. You had also talked about fire suppression and the impact that that had a little bit. Are there other management techniques that you are trying to use to try to, help with that because fires are not as possible right now?
Yeah, mainly the planting and release. We don't use herbicide on the reservation at all, so that's it makes it more difficult to manage the forest, but overall it's better. It's better for the water. It's better for neighboring native species. So it takes a little bit longer and a little bit more work.
Yeah. So we did have a couple of other questions. Any effects on the released white pine from white pine borers impacting the leader?
Well, we try to keep somewhat. We don't have any like plantations of white pine that are young, so by underplanting aspen, we keep enough shade to where that white pine weevil doesn't impact. So the trees are able to grow more straight and towards any canopy gaps, which are more or less straight up. And so we don't have impacts from the weevil that I've noticed. If there's any impacts, it's rabbit browse or whatever animals are able to get to it. But for the most part, we've had really good survival.
Great. Another one that came through is thank you, Gina, for sharing Bad River strategy. This sounds like a really great ecological. Okay. The question is, does this forest have any prescribed burn plans?
At the current time, we don't have any burn plans in the works, but we do. I've been a wildland firefighter for over 10 years now. And so I hope that eventually we can get to the point where we're doing some burning in the forest. We have some plans for some cattail burnings in the sloughs, but that really, that's not going to impact the forest. But yeah, that's definitely one of our goals.
And then we just have one last question, and then we should probably move on. But how does underplanting, monitoring of underplanting, and maintenance of underplanting work, especially with yellow birch?
Yellow birch, we're not really releasing because they're able to grow in low light conditions. And they're more shade tolerant than the white pine, I think. So the only release work that we've done is on the white pine.
Great. Well, thank you so much. That was super interesting. I think we are going to move on to our next speaker.
All right. Thank you, Johanna, and great presentation, Gina. So my name is Matt Dallman, as Johanna had mentioned. I work for the Nature Conservancy. I've been with the Conservancy now for about 30 years, mostly based in Wisconsin. My current role is working with the Midwest Division, which I'm now working with my colleagues in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, all within that northern forested area, thinking about how do we implement strategies to protect and improve the management of lands. And obviously, climate and understanding climate is an important aspect to that. So let me share my screen here, which I should have been doing earlier. And Joanna, can you give me a thumbs up that you're actually seeing my screen? All right, good. So I am going to share an example of a project that we've been working on for several years that is just a bit south of the area that Gena was talking about. It is a much more tangible 1,000 acres for us to get our hands around, not the huge landscape that Gena's talking about, but it's an example that I'll talk at the end about tweaking our management style and understanding and sharing that information with others so that we can both export and import understanding around climate work. So I'm going to be sharing our kind of a case study around our Carolyn Lake project just to give people orientation of where we're at in the world. Similar to the slide that Gena showed, this is Ashland. I don't know if my cursor is showing through, but this arrow on the top is where Gena's landscape was. I point to the photo because that is a really important wetland feature that is important to people as well as to the biodiversity and fish production in this part of Western Lake Superior. And when we started working in this landscape more than 30 years ago, we were partnering with Bad River to figure out how do we protect that resource. And it really focused us to focus on the forest because a lot of this landscape is forested and how that water flows through that system influences essentially this wetland complex. So we in in the late 1990s purchased 1,000 acres of land so that the Nature Conservancy as a conservation group could not only preach about sustainable forest practices, but actually show that we're doing it. So we are practicing what we're preaching, not just talking about it. So a little bit of detail on Carolyn Lake. It's about 1,000 acres, or 1,100 acres, I should say. We've owned it since '97. We acquired it from an industrial owner at the time that was looking to potentially sell it for higher and better use. We originally focused our management on looking back to the 1800s to say we're going to restore this forest to what it once was. And then somewhere in the mid 2000s, early 2000s, this climate change thing came up, and it really caused us to take a 180 on our planning and moved our perspective from 1850 to 2100. So in beginning to do that, we really wanted to dive in and say, okay, what do we have here? And we did a robust inventory on the property. And we developed a set of goals for Carolyn Lake that is essentially around, we're a little bit different of a forest owner. We really want to see biodiversity goals, ecological integrity and water quality. And especially the water quality side is that we want to make sure that when we're managing, we're maintaining the function of that forest so that the water that starts the headwaters of the Bad River system continues to be healthy and flow into that Bad River Kakagan Sloughs area that is so important to people and to the regional biodiversity in the area. We wanted to make sure that we were committed to long-term sustainable management. So this wasn't we're going to manage it once and be done. And what we wanted to do is step back in the landscape, look at what surrounded us. So we're surrounded by national forest land. We're surrounded by county forest land, industrial forest land, private owners. And what we wanted to do is to take a look at that landscape and what can we represent within that regional forest that is a little bit different or underrepresented by our neighbors. And we wanted to manage for that type of variation. So we want across that landscape to have a range of variation of age classes, species, composition, and structural diversity that is important to diversity in that landscape. So when we dove into this planning, we were working with our colleagues in Michigan at a project called Two-Hearted River. And at that point, we were both kind of co-developing what we called key ecological attributes, which is a set of metrics essentially that we can understand what we currently have and where do we want to go so that we can monitor and understand how our incremental management is making small changes towards the goals that we want to do. So the photo that you see on the far right side of the screen all the little white dots that you can't see on there are permanent rebar monitoring plots that we can come back and monitor. And we did a pretty intensive monitoring on this site just so that we could capture what we have and know how our management is making differences in the right or wrong direction. The unique thing that we did with this is that we hired a consultant group to come out and do a really extensive literature review and then identify 3 reference stands from across the Upper Peninsula in Wisconsin to go in and take forest measurements. So we identified 3 areas that were what we felt to be least impacted and modified from human use in the past. And we wanted to then compare how those forests look to the forests that we currently had so that we had an understanding of how changed from past natural growth that our forests are. And again, this was really pre climate planning, but it was really foundational information that we collected to understand how we can move our forest in the direction that we wanted to go. So this is maybe one of the poorest, PowerPoint slides you all will probably see. It's not meant for you to read, but meant to just give you an idea, understanding that what we are trying to develop is this baseline of if we are in a poor condition, what does it mean to be fair, good, or very good, and where do we want to go with certain aspects of our forest? We tried to mimic typical forest measurements or measurements that you could that foresters typically take in forest stands that you could then modify, although we collected things like coarse woody debris and other potential information that may not be always collected. But we tried to make this not a process that would be so financially cumbersome for anybody else to do because we want this to be kind of a real life example of what people can do on their own lands as they think about the management of their forests. So moving from that messy slide to the information that we collected was essentially our stocking, acceptable growth, and tree species diversity, how that's scattered across the stands. We want to know about coarse woody debris, our distribution of age, size classes, and a little bit of age across that forest, and then information about what do we have coming up in the understory about our established seedling and desired established seedlings. So as climate change came into the picture more, and again, this is a project that we bought almost 30 years ago. It's surprising because it seems like we've all been dealing with climate change for our entire careers, but in the late 90s, early 2000s, that really wasn't part of our forest management practices or thinking. So as it came in, more online, we asked the questions about what do these metrics tell us about, the change in this forest due to climate change? What's at risk in our forests? And then if we, are managing, how do we reduce that risk? And then what are we missing? And what we decided from the information we had is we wanted to create these new metrics, which were essentially, a risk of decline metric. Like how can we determine whether the forest we have now will still be resilient in 2050, 2020, 2075 or 2100, and paint that picture of how we can incrementally manage to a more resilient future condition. So we decided to take a look at this risk of decline in our overstory trees, our saplings, and then our seedlings. So we understood what condition our forests are in, what the future of that forest is in, and how those, that seedling and the sapling stage determines where we go in the future based on climate risk. So we pulled in a bunch of climate science back then. We partnered with the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, several folks from the DNR to really sit down and think about the direction of our current forest and where we should take it in the future. We relied on science that's coming from the tree atlas projections, and we developed essentially a spreadsheet that looked at trees that were at risk were defined as where the suitable habitat for that tree would decline by more than 20% by 2100. We also wanted to really make sure that we were thinking about where we were within a regional context. We are in a climate shadow essentially of Lake Superior, and that the projections of decline may not hit evenly across that landscape, and that having that large refrigerator of Lake Superior may allow us to lifeboat or support certain species that may decline in other parts of their range just because of the geographic area that we're in. So the example that I just showed on the quaking aspen are kind of the data of how we are looking at our stand that we are individual species we have in our stands now. That's information from Tree Atlas. But if you can look at this aspen stand, current distribution, the blues and greens are where they're really happy. As you look at low emission scenario, which is the middle box, you can see how those blues change, the greens change. And then underneath the high emission scenario, we're talking about this species being considerably at risk. So we use these projections and modeling to determine how we are implementing our forest management on the stand. So what does this look like in practice? So this is a northern hardwood stand at Carolyn Lake. It is incredibly diverse for the most part in this part of the world. I think there's 13 different species on this stand, but if you look, we're really heavy into sugar maple, white ash, basswood, yellow birch, aspen, bigtooth aspen, and red maple for the most part. The other species are present, but obviously not as important. So when we took this information and then compared it to the species that, or to the climate change data and looked at the low emission scenario, the species that are at risk to decline were about 11% of our stand. So we can deal with that. We can manage the stand pretty well, think about traditional practices and not really change much of our work as it relates to how do we proceed with our desired future conditions. We're still pretty good at the low emission scenario. So I'm assuming most of us on this call realize that we are going past that low emission scenario. We'll likely pass this high scenario at some point too. But this high emission scenario is kind of how we're thinking about our forest and the impact of climate on that forest. And what we found is that we're sitting with a forest in this hardwood stand at 63% of the species we have there are at risk. So this changes the way that we think about forestry in this stand. This isn't much different than a lot of northern hardwood stands in northern Wisconsin, probably in the UP. This is a second growth cutover forest. We have a little bit of a change in the species composition. We know white pine was much more prevalent in this stand. In fact, it's not even it wasn't even picked up here, but we find large stumps that we know that it was here. So this type of information has changed the way that we think about what we do. The second worst slide you'll ever see in a PowerPoint is probably this one. It's not meant to read, but it's meant to identify the resources available. And just to kind of put a caveat that climate science is constantly changing. And what we need to do is to constantly keep up with this change a little bit and modify the table like I showed you in the previous slide based on the newest science that's coming in. It's a challenge sometimes because we all know that when we're making management decisions in a forest, those are generational changes and we can't make changes quickly. And science is changing quicker than we can manage in our stands. So that's why one of the precautions you'll see at the end of this presentation is that we're not making any drastic major changes all at once. We're incrementally making slow change, testing, monitoring, and then going back and adapting. So this resource exists. If you just type in forestadaptation.org, it is a wealth of information that's out there and something that a lot of us managers should have readily available on your desktop bookmark. So just to illustrate what I'm talking about in the way that we're using this climate science to manage our stand here, this map, if you just take a look at it in generally, the legend in the lower left-hand sides of those the maps identify that yellows are our least at-risk stands and the browns are our most at-risk stands and the orange and red are in between. And I just draw your attention to the north east corner or the northern part of these maps. If you look at the middle map or the map that's more in the center of the slide, that's our overstory condition. And the one that's farther to the right is our established regeneration. So when we're thinking about removing trees, and if you just look at stand 39, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but it's in the west side of that upper 160 acre block up there. If you look at the overstory, we're orange, saying that 21 to 40% of our stands are our species in that stand are at risk. But if you look at our understory in the established regeneration, that if we poke holes into that stand, what we release is in a worse condition than a higher risk, I should say, than what we have in the overstory. So this is automatically, these maps help illustrate what we need to do in advance. We probably need to go in there and do some pre-treatment potentially, or we change the prescription and have our logger run over and remove and cut all balsam that's in that understory, so we're not releasing balsam in this stand, because that is not probably likely the reason why that stand is so brown. So this has been really helpful in illustrating with our consultant foresters that are working on our stand, and for us to understand how do we incrementally move this forest into a more resilient condition based on the available science. So we have this information for all our stands, and we have the data behind it. We know why this brown established regeneration is as brown as it is. We know the species, and then we can do the planning in advance to manage. So as Gena showed in her slide, she was focusing on strategy 5. This is the adaptation strategies, or the adaptation menu and the strategies that are touching down at Carolyn Lake. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I just wanted to highlight that we are obviously watching out for invasives and trying to remove those as we can. While we don't have the low deer numbers that Gena has and the reservation, we do have lower numbers in this part of the world, so it gives us more options for underplanting and how much tending and maintenance and monitoring we have to do with those. But the strategy I would really want to highlight here is strategy 9. And this is kind of what we're doing with our management. We're incrementally favoring native species that are expected to be better adapted for future conditions. And that's how this has changed our management to some degree. Just looking at our table for management actions in this northern hardwood stand, we have 640 acres of that system or that type. Our initial management, when we started, again, looking back in time, it was about single tree group selection type of methods, the standard, how do we maintain sugar maple and some diversity and get some regeneration in pockets in those stands. When we think about climate, what we're doing is we're thinking about a little bit about how do we use single tree selection to create these targeted gaps to remove or advance or release the regeneration that we have in these stands. We want to make sure that we're trying to create a condition that is going to be diverse in structural and age and species. We're even thinking and doing implementing large group or shelterwood type of harvest in these stands to release oak. We don't want to put our essentially proverbial eggs in one basket, because we know about oak wilt and issues with that. But what we want to do is increase the importance value of oak in the stand, because it is a climate winner. Where we have opportunities to promote white pine, cherry, and oak, we're doing it. And we have actually gone in and underplanted with white pine in some areas. And then we're maintaining some of these unique pockets of hemlock and yellow birch, basswood, pine that used to be that kind of snapshot back in time of what that older northern forest looked like. We don't have a lot of it, and what little we have, we want to maintain. We're not getting a lot of hemlock regeneration just because of the amount of deer that we have there. So we want to sustain that seed source until there's an opportunity to promote that species in a different way. So that is kind of the example or the illustration between how our historical thinking of how we'd manage versus thinking about adaptation strategies and climate change the way that we're moving our forests. So just to wrap up here, some of the lessons that we've learned in this is that we want to maintain or increase the species diversity, especially favored towards climate adapted species. We're not doing anything drastic. We're not because sugar maple is projected to be a large decliner in this part of the world. We're not removing all sugar maple. Where we think it'll still persist by 2100, we'll still have sugar maple, but we are trying to make that stand more diverse and by taking these small steps that I talked about. Again, thoughtful, steady, nothing drastic, and we think that that's going to lead to a little bit more resilient forest in the end. We're trying to eliminate invasive species. We don't have much right now. A little bit of honeysuckle, not much buckthorn, but it seems to be coming up more and more in weird places or all over that forest on an annual basis. So continuing to monitor that. We don't have the traditional garlic mustards or anything, but definitely watching out for any of those species to make sure we tackle them while they're small and not a problem. I mentioned this earlier, but one of the things that is a benefit of that forestadaptation.org site, silvicultural library, is sharing this information and learning from others, and then adapting our work. And that's kind of our final lesson that we've learned here is, there's nothing cookie cutter anymore. We're monitoring and figuring out our practices essentially on every time that we return to manage. It may be different than what we thought we were going to do 15 or 20 years before that. And it's just the nature of what we have to deal with given how things are changing, and science is trying to keep up with that. So with that, I think I'm at time, and be happy to respond to any questions that people might have. I wanted to mention while you're thinking of questions that I did not leave my email or contact information, but I think maybe through this session or through Susan or something, you can track me down, or even online, you should be able to track me down about, and I'm willing to share our management plan, anything we have on this Carolyn Lake, just to get that information into the hands of managers if people want that. So with that, Joanna, I can't seem to stop sharing.
Yeah, kind of. So first of all, if anyone else has any questions, again, please use the Q&A model. We can, or the Q&A feature. We can take questions for both of our speakers, so it would be helpful if you write in with your question who you'd like to ask that question to. But just kind of starting out, Matt, going along with what you said, if someone wanted to kind of replicate the strategy that you're talking about, or do that on a property that they're working on or the property that they own, what would be the best way to get started on that?
Yeah, I think that adaptation menu, which I just showed a portion of, is a really good place to start. Most of the foresters that are out there also should have, and I'm going to put a pitch in for, again, this is a document that you can see. It's going to be backwards, but it's essentially these climate change field guides. We have them for northern Wisconsin, southern Wisconsin, Minnesota, and all the UP. And I think that those are really good resources. So look at that adaptation menu, think about the forest that you have, think about the species that are there, use resources like this field guide, and really think about your landowner goals and then the future resilience of that forest. And I think you can mimic what we're doing here just by using those tools, is really thinking about not necessarily, what that forest was, but eventually what that forest is going to be, and incrementally making small change over time. So
That's great. Yeah, so we do have a few more minutes if folks have any other questions. Oh, wonderful. A question just came in. How do local market/loggers' interest in these partial harvest system influence your management strategies? In northern Minnesota, we have lower quality northern hardwood cover types, so heavier cutting systems, borderline clear cutting, is often viewed as the only viable/marketable approach. Any suggestions to overcome those limitations?
that is a really good question, and it's becoming more and more of a challenge. We ideally would love to manage, you know, 30 acres or 10 acres, or go in and out on a frequent basis where needed. And what we see with our changing markets and the economics behind logging, we need to offer sales that are a lot larger scale. So we are probably not taking the volume off. I've, in many cases, if we're not offering 10 cords per acre, we can't even attract a bidder on the stand. So we need to think about, can we offer, 6 to 7 or 7 to 8 cords per acre, but offer higher value species within it. So we really do think about the scope and scale of management at each time. So we're offering more acres, and we're also thinking really strategically about not just keeping all the big trees, but thinking about how we can diversify our age class distribution in those stands, in offering some of the trees that may have more value and just allow us to do the management. What's interesting is the Nature Conservancy is a different manager. And when we first got into this game 30 years ago, we were thinking, well, you buy it and you set it aside and nature takes its course. And in many cases, nature will, but on a time frame that is much beyond what we can, probably influence or consider. And with climate change, it really changes the equation because things are happening so quickly. We need to have active management in many of these stands to be able to keep them healthy. And with the economics that we're having right now, we need to think about it from a logger's perspective and to get them in there. And I think we can really see the way that we can have healthy forest biodiversity and hopefully maintain, that logging economy, because without it, we lose our tools to address, wind, pest pathogens, and modify our forests to more climate resilient state. So we got to be thinking together as a community, from conservation to forestry, on how we sustain that business, because otherwise our forests are going to have a hard time. We're going to have a hard time adapting our forests to climate change. So I don't know if that answered your question, but it is a challenge, more and more valuable where possible.
Great. We do have a question about, okay, so we did get a response, a solid answer, so thanks, someone said. But yeah, are there any other questions for our speakers? You had mentioned, and this was a question that I had, you had mentioned talking about trying to share information and learn from each other about some of these strategies. Is there a place that people can already start doing that, or is there a system for that?
Yeah, like I mentioned, I think that the forestadaptation.org site is a really good place. I don't know how. I know our information on Carolyn Lake is on that site. I'm not exactly sure how it got uploaded, but I'm sure the people that maintain that site can figure it out if you have examples. The other thing is the Great Lakes Silvicultural Library has a lot of good examples of projects that are in place, but those are two good resources. And then obviously talking to people like Gena that's working on it and other practitioners on the ground is another great way of working on it. The other is, if you don't know folks from the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, get to know folks like that. They are an amazing resource in this type of forest management.
Thank you. We did have a question come in for Gena. Besides brush saw release of those planted seedlings with no herbicide use, what other approaches have you tried to suppress aspen suckering?
Well, there aren't a lot of options. We haven't done a ton of timber sales here yet because we're kind of still in the process of getting that 10-year stewardship plan approved. But it's mainly going to come down to reducing the light availability because the aspen do need a lot of light to survive. So they might regenerate, but because of the shade, the suckers will likely die off at a fairly young age. But it's an interesting dichotomy. Ecological forestry is not a big moneymaker, so you can't really be in it for to make a lot of money. But the value of the result of ecological forestry is so much more valuable than money. So something to think about.
Well, great. I think those are all the questions I have so far, and we are hitting 1 o'clock. So I think we're gonna just wrap it up here. So I'm gonna share a slide quick. So first of all, I just want to thank both of our speakers that have helped us today. It was really great to hear about some of the things that you're working on, so we appreciate you being here. We also, as I mentioned earlier, we do have an evaluation, so please fill out the evaluation. You can use the QR code that's on the screen, or I believe that there are links in the chat to it as well. or if you have to run, the link will be on the website as well. So we appreciate any feedback that you can provide. And then also, I just want to put in a plug for next session. The next webinar is going to be on May 20th, again, starting at noon. And this webinar will focus on strategies 8 and 9, assisted migration, enhancing genetic diversity, and facilitating community transition. So yeah, I think that's all we have for you today. Thanks everyone for being here and participating.
Thank you.